Welcome back to Long Distance Worklife, where we help you lead, work, and thrive in remote and hybrid teams. I'm Marisa Eikenberry, a fellow remote worker, and joining me is my co-host and remote work expert, Wayne Turmel. Hi, Wayne.
Hello, Marisa. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I am very well, and I'm actually kind of geeked about the show this week.
As you should be. So, listeners, we're talking about return to office, which is not the first time that we've ever talked about this before. However, the spin that we're doing today is that we're talking about the differences between how the US handled it and how Europe has handled it or is handling it now. So, Wayne, I want to start off with what are the main differences that you've already observed between the US and European countries and how they're handling return to office?
Yeah, it's interesting because you can kind of get stuck in, and Americans in particular are really bad about this, where, if it doesn't center around the Statue of Liberty, it didn't happen, right?
Right. Eastern time zone or bust, right?
Right, exactly. And so I've been writing for management issues out of the UK for a billion years, it feels like. And I was doing some work for them and some research, and I was fascinated to find that return to office is much more prevalent in Europe and in a lot of other countries. Matter of fact, the US is severely different in the number of people. Just as a rough number, 70% of people in the UK have gone back to predominantly return to office, or not in the UK, but in Europe. Have gone back to 70% return to office, basically full time. Mm-hmm. In the US, it's more like 50%.
Right.
And we're talking about those, obviously, who can work remotely.
Of course.
Right. I mean, there was this whole thing. Everybody went home during COVID. Well, no, it was about a third of the population.
Right. It feels like a lot more people.
It feels like a lot more than that because we hang with who we hang with.
Right.
But 70 to 50 is a pretty significant difference. And so being me, I remember at 5, my grandmother actually stopped babysitting me for a while because I wouldn't stop asking why.
I could act like I'm surprised.
And I still to this day. And for those of you listening in audio only, it is a very shocked face.
Oh, absolutely.
So anyway, I started geeking out and going down the rabbit hole, and I figured this was a worthy discussion.
Absolutely. So, okay, we've already discussed 70 to 50. Like, that's a really big deal. So why is it that Europe seems to be having way more return to office people than we have? I mean, is it just people fighting back and be like, no, I want to work from home? Or is there something else?
No, I think there are, I'm going to say 3 because I'm doing this off the top of my head. There may be, and there are sub-reasons to those 3 reasons, but there are 3 things that strike me as most obvious. Number 1 is that most people in European cities live much closer to where they work.
Right.
Europeans in general do not commute long distances to go to work. And by the way, when we talk about the European numbers, there's a giant asterisk there that says everywhere but London.
Right. You and I have talked about this offline.
Yeah, we'll talk about why London is the outlier in a moment. But the fact is that most people in Europe do not have the hellish commutes that Americans have. And they are much more willing to use public transportation and all kinds of things. So as a result, the commute isn't as onerous as it is for North Americans.
That makes sense.
So, the number 1 reason Americans give for why do I want flexible, because the traffic is killing me and getting to work makes me miserable and
gas
I'm grumpy.
Prices.
I'm grumpy before I get there. And by the way, when I was home with COVID, I was saving $5,000 a year, and that's a real number for a lot of people. So the commute is a big part of that. So the commute comes out
that makes sense.
of the equation. The second thing, and this is very controversial, and I just talked about this at a conference this week and I got some hallelujahs and a lot of uncomfortable squirming in seats.
Oh, I can't wait for the podcast comments on this one then.
Well, it basically comes down to Americans view hybrid work in particular and the right to work from home as a perk.
Okay.
It's a perk. It's something they want. And the reason is Americans in particular do not get a lot of perks in terms of work.
That is
If
fair.
you think about the average European worker, their healthcare is paid for, their education is essentially paid for or extremely cheap. There are laws about how many hours you can work and not work.
Much longer vacation time.
More vacation time. All of those things are, if you get them through an American company, you get them through negotiation and bargaining and threatening to quit and all kinds of stuff, right?
Yeah, they aren't inherently there.
So there is, whereas companies are willing to say, yeah, you know what, we're not going to give you healthcare or do any of that other cool stuff, but if you want to work in your jammies a couple of days a week, we're good with that.
Right.
And so that's part of it, right? And that goes to the fact that the work-life balance in Europe is generally better. People are better at, I go to work and I work, and when I leave work and I don't think about it. So that they tend to enjoy the time they're there. They take that 8 hours and they work and they get their social contact with their friends and they work hard and they do their jobs and then it's done.
And then they go home and do it all over again.
And then they go home. So, you know, the ability to do that is already there. They don't put the same value on it that American workers have put on it.
Yeah, where it's almost like our identity, in our careers sometimes become our identity in many ways.
Well, it does. And, you know, we can get deeper into that. But the third reason, I'm trying to stick to three because I said I would. And I remembered the third reason as we were just talking, which is the infrastructure for working from home doesn't exist in a lot of places. And I noticed this at the beginning of COVID, where it was really problematic getting people in Asia, for example, to work from home. And then I realized why. If you live in Tokyo, you're living in an apartment the size of my garage with no distinct room to work in, right? You're trying to cut $1 million sales deals on the end of your bed. And that doesn't really work. And it's the same thing. Housing in Europe, especially in the cities, tends to be smaller apartments. Even the houses are smaller than we're traditionally used to here in America. And so the idea of having a home office is just physically not possible.
Yeah, no, that makes
for a lot
of
of people.
I hadn't thought about that.
I hadn't either. This is why we go down rabbit holes, because we learn stuff, right? So if you think about just those three things, right? The structure of the commute, going to work isn't that bad. Yeah. Well, okay. You know, if it's not a big deal, it's not a big deal. It ceases to become a bargaining chip when you're talking to your boss. You know, if you don't have a lot of perks, this has become, and by the way, flexible work is the number one thing people are asking for when they apply for jobs.
Yep.
So this is far more important here. There is a value on flexible work that just hasn't caught on in much of the rest of the world. Well, and then the third thing is, even if I am working from home, can I be as productive? Can I do the same job? And the answer is maybe not. It's not quite as convenient and simple as it is in North America. So those are kind of the obvious things. And there are some really interesting long-term impacts on this, which we can get to in a moment. I did mention that the outlier is London.
Right. Well, and I did want to go into something real before you get into London. So, and unfortunately, I don't have the data with me right this second. But wasn't there something, I want to say it was Switzerland, maybe it was Sweden, that it was like work from home was like a protected thing. Like it was like you had a right to work from home. How is that different than some of the other stuff that we're seeing?
Well, what's happening is that as a result of COVID, there was a big rush to codify things like how many hours can your boss expect you to work when you're not in the office, do the same labor laws that protect you in the workplace, protect you when you work from home. There was all kinds of that stuff. There was kind of rushing to judgment on a lot of that. And the countries that you would expect to do that, right? The countries that put a large value on work as part of the social experiment, right? Switzerland, Sweden, the Nordic country. You would expect that that's where the first of this would come. I think a lot of that has kind of come to nothing because so relatively few people are taking advantage of it now.
Gotcha.
Or when they do, they're kind of going along with the stealth work thing, which is going to work for a short period of time. Eventually, people will start running afoul of labor laws and things. And, somebody will always ruin it for everybody else.
Right. Like that happens all the time.
It's important to remember that every law was put in place and it made sense to the person who wrote it because they were trying to solve a specific problem.
Right.
Right. So it's interesting to see where it's going to shake out.
Right. And so going back to your thing about London, so how is London different?
London is really expensive and really big. And as a result, the commutes are hell. Basically, London as a work environment is much more like New York or Chicago.
Okay.
Than it is Amsterdam or Paris.
Okay, that makes sense.
The problems that you've got with stupid expensive housing and you can't even drive your car into the city of London without paying an entry fee every day. It's the only city that has a coverage charge.
Oh my gosh.
Which again was instituted to solve a specific problem, but there are unintended consequences to this. But basically, London it doesn't fit into the European model. The third reason, which also makes sense in London, is that there are so many international companies headquartered there.
Right.
That
so they're already doing remote
people are
work.
working. Yeah, well, they're doing flexible work in times of hours and whatever. And if I have to be in the office at 9:00, I don't want to still be there for the 9:00 at night call with the team in Singapore.
Absolutely. And I don't blame them for that.
Right. Now, the impact of all this is really interesting. One of the things is that European cities are already built.
Yes.
They've been there a long time. The footprint of the city is what it is. And as a result, there is less building going on all the time in these places. Right. And if you look at the square footage of business properties available, again, it is something like it's a vacancy rate of somewhere between 7 and 10% versus some American cities and London where it's getting close to 50. Like even if there are people in a building, there may not be people on all floors because businesses have kind of shrunk. And some of that is remote work and people not coming in. Frankly, some of it is automation, and we need less people than we needed 10 years ago to do the same job.
That makes sense too.
So all of these factors I found absolutely fascinating. And if you are the CEO of a company, if you're thinking about how do we come up with a policy that makes sense, if we are an international company, how do we come up with a policy that makes sense?
Right.
This is all stuff we have to take into consideration. And one of the things I wanted to do was just bring those facts out there and throw them on the table and go, I don't know what y'all are going to do with this, but there you are.
Right. So with all of this, like looking forward, what trends do you predict will emerge in the workplace because of this? Like, do you think that we're going to continue to see more return to office in Europe? Do you think that we're going to stay about the same in the US?
I think we will gradually see a rise in remote work, at least part-time. We're going to see a rise in hybrid work in all corners of the world. I think we're going to see that, but it's going to be more gradual. It wasn't like the sudden boom in remote, right?
Right.
I think we're going to see that. I think we're still seeing attention in North America And I said this and got more hallelujahs than not the other day when I said, in America, because of this idea of using it as a perk, instead of looking at it from the standpoint of the business and saying what's best for the business, it's not so much a strategy as it is a hostage negotiation.
Okay.
Where the company says, how much can we make them come into the office before they quit or won't come work for us? And the workers are going, how much can I avoid going into the office and still draw a paycheck?
Right.
And they've kind of settled on whatever formula, 2 days, 3 days a week that they've settled on, which is not really sustainable. And more importantly, it's not strategic.
Right. Yeah, there's no rhyme or reason for it.
Well, there's a rhyme and a reason. It's just, it's Vogon poetry, which means nothing to anybody who hasn't read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but it is poetry, and it is the worst poetry in the universe. So that's really where we are, I think. We've hit this compromise and we're kind of dealing with it. And long term, it's not going to progress and improve until we get strategic about it. What's going to happen is, and somebody actually said this, I can't remember who said it, but it was a quote and it hit all the business papers, said this whole return to office, remote work, hybrid work thing would just go away. What we need is 20% unemployment.
Okay.
Because then people will be so darn glad to have a job, they'll just shut up and show up.
Yeah. I feel like I've also heard that quote before or something like it.
Yeah. So
yeah,
that's where we are. And I thought this was a worthy discussion, right? It's like,
absolutely.
Will there be kind of a growing acceptance of hybrid work when people realize they aren't going to have to spend all day in their 500 square foot flat? Probably.
Yeah.
Right. Will Americans get the hang of it and figure it out? Maybe. But they're conversations worth having, and you can't make those decisions without context.
Absolutely.
So that's what we hope. That's what we hope we did today, was give you some context.
Absolutely. And I'll make sure to link to your management issues article inside of our show notes. So for people who want to read even more about this, it will be there. And listeners, thank you so much for listening to the Long Distance Work Life. For show notes, transcripts, and other resources, make sure to visit longdistanceworklife.com. If you haven't yet, subscribe to the podcast so you won't miss any future episodes. And while you're there, be sure to like and review. This helps us know what you love about our show. Feel free to contact us via email or LinkedIn with the links in our show notes. And let us know that you listened to this episode or suggest another topic for Wayne and I to tackle in a future episode. We'd love to hear from you.
Well, and one of the things, if you're kind of asking these questions about what's it like leading remotely, how is leading a hybrid team different, we would urge you to take advantage of our open enrollment programs. The Long Distance Leadership Series runs a couple of times a year. You can find out more on the kevineikenberry.com site. We would love to have you or talk to you about delivering that content inside your organization. Marisa, bring us home.
Absolutely. And you can learn more about that at kevineikenberry.com/LDLS. Thank you so much for joining us, Wayne. Thank you for saving me for a second right there. And as Wayne likes to say, don't let the weasels get you down.